Today, I'll be talking about the homeless epidemic in the United States. First, I want to share a quote by Sheila McKechnie. People who are homeless are not social inadequates, they are people without homes. So, what is homelessness? The National Library of Medicine defines it as an individual who lacks a fixed, regular, and adequate nighttime residence. To define it from a sociological standpoint, homelessness is not an abrupt experience, rather, it is the culmination of a long process of economic hardship, isolation, and social dislocation that has affected an individual or family. The scope of homelessness is vast. Shelter is a fundamental human right, yet, according to the National Alliance to End Homelessness, approximately 17 out of 10,000 people in the United States are houseless. And on the bottom, we can see a bar graph showing the rise of homelessness from 2015 to 2024, including both sheltered and unsheltered. So one of the main reasons homelessness has stayed a consistent issue is due to the stigmatization of it. Dominant social narratives around the issue falsely blame the victim, as people believe it is a result of one's laziness, addiction, or bad personal choices. According to academic knowledge and contemporary poverty, the politics of homelessness research, homelessness research isn't only limited by the perception of homeless people, rather it is shaped by how we study the structural forces behind homelessness. The article states that under neoliberalism, issues of power and inequality are viewed, therefore treated as technical problems, meaning it can be fixed with small surface level interventions. This mindset assumes everyone is a consumer driven by the capitalist society in which we live. This idea is an ignorant assumption because it separates the presence of poverty and privilege, which are both very prevalent. Um, and it leads people to believe homelessness is an individual issue rather than a byproduct of larger social inequalities. When acknowledging the root issue behind homelessness, it can bridge the divide between those who suffer from it and those who don't, because it adds an aspect of relatability. The majority of people are disadvantaged because of some systemic issue, whether it's discrimination on the basis of race, color, gender, sexual orientation. Um, it can invoke empathy as people can understand the hardships of being dealt a poor hand. In order to address these false preconceptions, we need to discuss how and why they're present, sorry. So to do this, we must unpack the socialization, media, and public perception surrounding homelessness. In modern day, new media has a significant impact on our lives. It can be used for both the better and the worse, because it provides accessible platforms to preach and receive information. The flexible atmosphere of social media apps like TikTok leaves room for both manipulation and creation, which is significant to note because although there are spaces on these apps for politics and social issues, a lot of the time they only gain traction when they're trending. Um, Although this can deceitfully seem productive, and a positive side to social media, which it can be in some cases, many times it results in shallow and ingenuine approaches or discussions of the topic at hand. This is because pop culture typically only boosts trendy causes, which result in temporary fixes, leaving the pressing issue that was once dominating your feed in the dust. The trend-based environment social media fosters affects how people understand homelessness. It leaves people with the notion that it is an individual choice, framing it as an achieved status. This notion reduces empathy and feelings of responsibility, which result in little action. This also bleeds into the concept of ideal culture versus real culture. While the government claims to protect and support its citizens, which is our ideal culture, in actuality, they neglect and sometimes actively act against those with the least power and resources, which is real culture. While harmful, this is not new. There are a vast number of examples that align with ideal versus real culture, ranging from marriage to the environment. Um, which is why I believe the real problem is the lack of care within the public for homeless people. The socialization of homelessness can be seen in the absence of its discussion. Politicians lie all the time in politics, typically for personal motives. While unproductive, the presence of these lies means something in themselves. It means that the public cares about them enough to where politicians almost have to lie about them. But this isn't the case with homelessness. The conversation around it is so small that people in power don't bother to like pretend to care. Um, yeah. So homelessness is most accurately representative of conflict theory. Conflict theory shows the way inequalities contribute to social, political, and power differences and how they perpetuate power. In specific, discussing how resources or resource distributions contribute to these inequalities, um, which is, in this case, the root cause of homelessness. Under a conflict theory lens, homelessness is a result of unequal access to wealth, resources, and housing, federal and state policies, and arguably one of the most significant ones, the criminalization and stigmatization of the unemployed, addicted, and mentally ill. Put simply, homelessness is an outcome of the capitalist system by which we live because it prioritizes profit over human need. Um, to dive into the specifics and accurate causes of homelessness, there are many structural causes such as wealth inequality and poverty, housing inflation slash gentrification, lack of affordable housing, racialized inequality and discrimination, and state policies, just to name a few. Um, However, in homelessness is a housing problem, how structural factors explain US patterns. The authors identify the two largest causes of homelessness in major metropolitan cities, which were rental costs and vacancy rates. To better conceptualize these reasons, we will turn to the National Alliance to End Homelessness. As they say, homelessness is a result of the widening gap between people's income and the cost of living. According to them, the average minimum wage worker in the US has to work 95 hours weekly, which is 2.4 full-time jobs, to afford a one-bedroom rental home at the fair market rent. Additionally, fewer people have access to the benefits they need, as the Temporary Assistance for Needy Families program served approximately one-third as many households in 2020 as it did in 1996, which leaves family trapped in poverty and house insecurity. Max Weber's iron cage is the idea of being trapped in a modern society that is dominated by bureaucracy and rationalization. Within these societies, people are treated less like individuals and more like data points, harming their sense of individuality and fostering an environment where policies are prioritized over compassion. It shows how social system can dehumanize people and define who is worthy of support. Viewing this metaphor in terms of homelessness, we can look at housing programs, welfare systems, and shelters, which all operate with pretty strict rules, as they require things like sobriety, minimum work hours, clean criminal records, which simply isn't possible for many people. The Iron Cage helps us understand how people experiencing homelessness become stuck in cycles they can't escape. Um, and it places blame fairly on the bureaucratic system, which create these barriers, which keep marginalized groups powerless. Another lens we can look through to understand how socialization blames the individual is addiction. So, according to Medicalization Defining Drug Use, research shows that people with addiction often internalize public stigma, leading to self-stigmatization, which leads to feelings of shame, which perpetuate how addiction is socially constructed. Additionally, stigma is present at many levels, individual, social, and institutional. Institutionally speaking, stigma is very harmful, as it materializes into laws and healthcare practices that discriminate against and disproportionately harm addicts. Racial and class-based differences are also present in how addiction is stigmatized and ultimately treated, leading to what sociologists call the medicalization of deviance. So under the medicalization of deviance, certain behaviors that were once labeled as bad undergo a transformation to sick. However, this is not applied equally to different social groups. If you haven't heard this term before, you definitely have seen it. An example being when a wealthy alcoholic is labeled as sick or given sympathy because they are struggling with addiction. Within this context, it's seen as a disease, and therefore they have easier access to treatments like rehab. But a homeless alcoholic is not given the same attitude. They are typically classified as lazy, irresponsible, sometimes even dangerous. Instead of treatment, they face criminalization. To further examine how inequalities can become internalized, it's important to discuss symbolic interactionism. Through these micro level concepts, the ideas we discussed earlier, I think will be made a little clearer. So there's like a chain reaction. So it starts with collective consciousness, which refers to shared beliefs, values, and ideas. that bind individuals together. And this equates to the false public assumptions about the homeless that we discussed earlier. The looking glass self is how individuals form their own identity based on how they think others view them. Their identity is built through everyday social interactions. Labeling theory adds to this by showing how being repeatedly labeled as deviant or undeserving can shape a person's behavior and self-concept or perception over time. Digging a little deeper, we can view famous theorist Du Bois' idea of double consciousness, which looks at the internal conflict caused by living in a society that dehumanizes you. This usually results in experiencing two identities. One is the identity you see through your own eyes, and the other is through the eyes of society. So, to understand how these exclusions push people into behaviors that align with society's assumptions, I think it's noteworthy to discuss control theory. So, homeless people are cut off from social bonds and institutions like family and work and school, which in general can help guide an individual's behavior and understanding of what is socially acceptable. So, this isolation leads them to act in ways that reinforce the negative public perception. Um, Additionally, folkways are one of the main reasons I was drawn to talk about homelessness. I live in New York, in the city, where there is an abundant amount of people living on the streets, and the societal norms surrounding it always, I mean, disgusted me, but at the same time interest me. Um, it has become a folk way to ignore the homeless on the street, walking past without eye contact, avoiding conversation, or pretending just not to see them when they're asking for help. Um, that's ordinary behavior, which it shouldn't be. Folkways are learned through socialization, and they can communicate the idea that the homeless is not something to be acknowledged or engaged with, which just like reinforces this idea of like invisibility. So, after all this, the question stands, how do we combat this issue of homelessness? What are productive but also feasible solutions? Looking at the politics of homelessness in the United States, Gene Williams presents two solutions. These solutions come in the form of two different policy models, the linear treatment first model and the housing first model. The linear approach requires individuals to satisfy behavioral conditions such as sobriety, like mentioned earlier, before eligible for stable housing. The housing first model provides permanent housing without preconditions, offering optional services afterward. Williams argues that housing first not only preserves human dignity, but saves money by reducing reliance on services and the criminal justice system. However, she emphasizes that the effectiveness of this model is limited by the severe shortage of affordable housing and the fact that many programs currently focus only on the chronically homeless. From a conflict theory perspective, these solutions are strong on the surface, as they highlight the structural barriers that perpetuate homelessness. However, they also reveal that simply providing housing does not challenge the inequalities that create this issue in the first place. Another that can be found is it validates selective aid. So by prioritizing only the chronically homeless, which refers to people who experience long-term or repeated homelessness and have a disabling condition, it allows the government to kind of claim progress while ignoring the broader systemic crisis, and the vast amount of people that do suffer with it. Sociological research suggests that addressing homelessness effectively requires both structural and policy level solutions. So rather than framing homelessness as an individual failing, society should focus on expanding affordable housing, improving access to healthcare and mental health services, providing long-term supportive programs like Housing First. Policy should also aim to reduce stigma by treating addiction and mental illness as medical issues rather than moral failings. Um, These recommendations highlight the need to redistribute resources and political power, ensuring that marginalized groups are not left trapped by these systemic inequalities. Um, I would think sociologists would promote transformative justice, like emphasizing prevention, support, and structural reforms over retributive justice, which focuses primarily on punishments and short-term fixes. So, in conclusion, Homelessness is not simply the result of individual choices, but a complex social problem shaped by structural inequalities, stigma, and societal norms. Using a sociological framework through lenses like conflict theory and symbolic interactionism, we can see how power, labels, and social expectations influence both public perception, self-perception, and how those work to instill harmful policy responses. Concepts like the iron cage, the looking glass self, and double consciousness show how collective attitudes affect the identity and opportunities of people experiencing homelessness. By understanding homelessness sociologically, we move beyond stigma and individualization, advocating for policies and cultural shifts that recognize housing as a basic human right. A sociological perspective helps people view it through a more black and white lens, simply left to wonder why our neighbors are left on the streets with nowhere to go.